All right, my job to introduce Dr. Matt Hill from the University of Iowa. The title that he's going to present will be on the title slide here, but it's really cool. We're going to take a trip to the Chesapeake Bay region and learn about dogs and relationships between Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and European colonists. Been at the University of Iowa for 17 years. If you're interested in his publication record, check out Plains Anthropologist, Archaeologist? Archaeologist.
Plains Anthropologist.
Plains Anthropologist. And you know me, I like to share out little tidbits that you can't find on the internet. Don't buy the man coffee, buy the man Pepsi. That's all I'm saying. Okay, Dr. Matt Hill.
All right, I'm impressed with that one. Thank you. Wow, all right, that was a good one. All right, thank you all for coming. I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad to be back in Tucson. It's been quite a while. And I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk about a new research project that I'm doing that's looking at kind of a very dynamic time period, at a very dynamic place, and a very interesting relationship between humans and dogs in the Chesapeake Bay area. But before I begin, I have a dark secret. I don't have a dog. In all these kinds of talks, it's invariable at the end, you get pictures of dogs. I don't have one. So I will leave moments for you to all walk out. But the reality is that as a wandering archaeologist, my wife and I decided, I had dogs as kids, but as we decided to have cats. And it's interesting, as part of that, as part of an untrustworthy cat person, I've always been fascinated with people's love of dogs. And it's not just individuals, it's entire cultures, and this long history that we've had with dogs has always fascinated me. So it was kind of thrust upon me to teach about dogs. I have a course called Our Lives with Dogs, and I started doing research on dogs. And what I was fascinated by was, as different and complex as different cultures are, dogs are always by their sides, and has been for nearly 20,000 years. But it's interesting is that they're always there, and in many ways, very, very different cultures share similar traits in the relationship with the dog, and in other ways, they're different. And that was actually the inspiration for this project, is to look at how dogs are in the same environment, in the same time, but with different people. And what do you see as similar, and what do you see as different? And my project is in the Chesapeake Bay area, basically what is now Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. And this was kind of a good choice because it's a really dynamic time, particularly at the time of contact with European cultures. And it was an environment inhabited by at least 3 different cultures: Native Americans, Europeans, English primarily, and slightly later, enslaved Africans and their descendants. This was a really dynamic time frame and a very dynamic environment in which English were controlling and manipulating socially, politically, and personally Native Americans and enslaved Africans. But at the same time, all 3 of these groups maintained dogs and had, on a variety of fronts, their companionship, as a worker, as a symbol, dogs played a role in each of their lives. And now, this is also an environment in which there were strict boundaries defined by race, class, gender. And people were kind of confined to those social boundaries by strict laws and social rules. But dogs were an interesting one. They worked in this area, but they could move between those borders. But they also themselves were used, as I'll talk a little bit about, to mark and demarcate the differences in race and class and social standing. So basically, very early in this project, but the basic premise is I just want to see, in one place, in a rough time around contact, and a little before, how are dogs playing? How are they similar, and how are they different? And so I want to look at how their role in life, their biology a little bit, their ritualistic or kind of spiritual value, and then I want to talk about them as food. So, well prior to the arrival of Europeans, roughly minimally 14, 15,000 years ago, perhaps even older, indigenous people lived in and around the Chesapeake Bay. In this region, approximately 60 Native American groups from 3 different language families see this broad region as their homeland. Now, it's a very diverse linguistically, cultural, economic groups that are in this area. But for many of the indigenous people there, they're Algonquin speakers. And our best estimate archaeologically is that they arrived in this region roughly about 1900 years ago. And roughly about 800 years ago, Siouan people moved from down into the north and surrounding this area. At the time of contact, much of the coastal plains of this region were part of an alliance of the Powhatan Confederacy. It was basically a chiefdom-level society that controlled, roughly 30 or 40 major settlements in the area. Now, surrounding that were other Algonquin speakers that actually were not affiliated with the chiefdom and occasionally were even antagonistic to them. Surrounding that were other Siouan speakers that kind of moved into the area slightly later. Now, before contact, centuries before contact, most indigenous people lived in kind of large agricultural villages, mostly along major river valleys, some along shorelines or on the edges of marshy areas. And at least ethnohistorically, we see evidence, strong evidence, that it was a fairly hierarchical society in which there was kind of a chief elite that had great sway and influence over many people and their economic decisions. But it was a multi kind of ethnic, linguistic area for Native peoples. But even despite that, there were ties and social connections. You see trade and exchange of certain symbolic ceramics that indicate that each of these ethno-linguistic groups seem to have a strong commitment to identifying spiritual areas in which there was kind of multi-community feasting going on, and in fact, rituals, mortuary rituals that involved humans and dogs, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But dogs were kind of throughout this environment, and all of these different kind of indigenous people had dogs and used dogs for basically just as warnings in villages to alert people that visitors were coming. There's good ethnohistoric evidence that they were used to track and hunt birds of different sorts, and even there was a seasonally communal deer hunting, and there are accounts of dogs being used to drive deer into traps or into areas where hunters were located. Starting in the late 1400s, European sailors started to sail up and down the East Coast and mapping the East Coast and visiting, and often making landfall and interacting with indigenous people. In the 1500s, both the Spanish and the English made attempts to settle this region that were ultimately failures. But in 1607, in the spring of 1607, the English settled the Jamestown colony and began centuries-long English domination of this area. Now, the earliest English settlements were actually corporate enterprises that actually struggled and were, frankly, reliant on indigenous groups for their food and trade to survive. Over the decades, eventually, the English settlements became more independent, larger, and then became to dominate the indigenous communities. Now, most of the early English settlements were designed to be agricultural centers, particularly tobacco after about 1619. And as a result, labor was invariably in short supply. And the English, just like the Spanish before them, chose to deal with that labor shortage initially by enslaving the indigenous people. War and disease quickly made that a very untenable solution for basic labor demands. So the importation and immigration of indentured servants became the prominent way labor was done and population increase. But in about the early 1700s, tobacco prices crash and the financing to deal with bringing in and paying for the import of indentured service became unviable. So they turned to slaves. And African slaves had been first brought into this region in 1619. But it really wasn't until the early part of the 1700s when slavery became an established and very widespread institution. But dogs were everywhere in the English landscape. In fact, dogs were symbols of all the inequality and variability within English society. So they brought European dogs to terriers to eat the rodents. They brought in shepherd dogs to follow the flocks. They brought in hunting dogs. They brought in very large kind of mastiffs and other very large to chase and harass both Native Americans and enslaved Africans. Dogs literally defined who you were and where you were. So a lot of the farm work and the hunting and all that was male space. The cute lap dogs were brought in were used and lived with by kind of rich white women in the heads of these households. They themselves were segregated and isolated socially by race and class themselves. And they eventually, and later in time, President Washington and Jefferson were famously breeders of their own dogs. And they would often ship in dogs to improve their breeds of dogs. And in fact, they had greyhounds and other fancy dogs that reflected their social status. They, in fact, intentionally selected dogs that the kings and gentry of England had themselves to show their status. Dogs were everywhere. Enslaved people and their descendants undoubtedly had very ambivalent views of dogs. They, in their jobs as servants or field workers, were forced to work and live and often take care of their owner's dogs. Now, they undoubtedly were incredibly fearful of the mastiffs and large hound dogs that were literally called slave dogs that were used to harass and attack them. They were also equally likely quite disgusted by looking at the cute lap dogs or the pampered bloodhounds that the white hunters used for their hunts, that they had to be taken care of, and undoubtedly saw that the dogs were fed better than they were and more cared for than they were. But enslaved people and later free blacks had their own dogs. And in fact, dogs themselves for these groups were a way to symbolize their humanity and independence in the insufferable conditions of slavery and racism that they faced on a daily basis. Their dogs were used for a variety of ways. They would take them out and dogs would provide them protection when they went in the wild and to keep wild animals at bay. They would alert the enslaved people or free blacks when a rich landowner or their overseer was coming so they could be prepared. They also were incredible aids in hunting that allowed enslaved people to supplement their own diet, and in fact, in many cases, to create resources that they could sell to give themselves some independence in a time and a place where they had none. Dogs were incredibly important to all three groups. So we're still in the beginning of this process, and ultimately, in the long term, we are going to kind of look at DNA, we're going to look at isotopes, we're going to look at kind of more archaeological collections. But the first thing I've started, and what I want to kind of talk about what we found, is what dogs are out there and whose dogs are they? So through a combination of looking at site files and CRM reports and published articles and doing my own research on about 15, 16 collections, I found that there are 126 components from 107 sites across Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware that have dogs. So if you look at the distribution of sites, this pie graph is kind of showing the percentage of the sites associated with each group. There's roughly a comparable number of Native American and Euro-American sites, and only a very small number of African American sites with dogs. All of these sites are with dogs. And they range in age from about 1900 years ago to what's known then as the early woodland, up until basically pre-World War II. Most of the dog sites are residential sites, villages, households, things like that. But there is actually other kinds of sites, commercial sites, basically businesses, ceremonial sites, and others. Based on this review in our own kind of inventory, there's at least 63,000 dog bones representing 360 dogs. Now, this is a minimum. There's a couple of provisions on this number. One is that most site reports just say dogs are present, and so they're not included. Only a small subsample will actually count them. And there's one site that I'll repeat and look at again and again, called the Hatch site, that has about 90% of these dogs, and that's kind of a special circumstance. Now, if you look at through time, the blue Native American sites, they're mostly in the late woodland period, basically about 1,000 years ago, right up until contact. Most of the Euro-American sites are about the first 200 years of colonialism that have dogs. And then the small number of African American sites are kind of equally distributed through time. So how many remains of dogs are found at these sites? And these bar graphs show basically the average and distribution. Essentially, for any site, no matter what affiliation you're talking about, there's actually very few dogs. There's only about 30 dog bones per site on average, and in fact, in many cases, there's many less. And they only represent about one dog per site. Now, there are some exceptions, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. There are a number of Native American sites and a small number of Euro-American sites that have substantial quantities of dozens of dogs. The Townsend site, the Buck Farm sites have dozens of dogs. And the Hatch site has almost 150. It's off the chart in every measure that we have. Okay, so I want to look at kind of biology, there's symbolic use, and then food. So the biology is kind of the least developed part of this project that we're only kind of starting to get into. But all of us, and in fact, archaeologists, professional archaeologists that look at this, always think when they talk about dogs in terms of breeds. And dogs as being one of the most morphologically, physically variable animal out there. It's not surprising that we talk about breeds. But we do have to know kind of that all dogs very likely have a shared ancestor that's about 23,000 years ago, and it may be in Siberia. There's always debates about where the origins of dogs are. But they're relatively new, their evolution of wolf, and they seem to evolve from a population of wolves that now seems to have disappeared. Native American dogs and European dogs actually seem to split genetically from this origins in Eurasia and one moves east, one moves west. And so Native American dogs all originate from a population that leaves Siberia, very likely with early humans, around 15,000 years ago. So they're all, in a long evolutionary sense, very related to each other. But European dogs and Native American dogs have been separated by 15 million years. And there's good genetic evidence to show that. Now, at the time of contact and the time frame that we're most interested in, Europeans had breeds of dogs. In fact, the names of dog breeds, Mastiff, Greyhound, Bloodhounds, are all very similar to what we know of. And in fact, those dog breed names go back undoubtedly into the medieval period. These are very old dog names that are breeds that we recognize today. Now, whether a greyhound or bloodhound from the 1500s is anything like what we have today is arguably very unlikely. They are genetically, behaviorally different. And in fact, most breeds today actually have been reinvented kind of in post-World War I, post-World War II time period, because dog populations from the world wars were disrupted and breeders had to actually reinvent these dogs. But they had breeds of dogs, and they recognized breeds of dogs, and the breed had kind of a specific function, a job. And that's European colonials brought those different breeds of dogs to do these different jobs. Now, it is arguable whether Native Americans had breeds of dogs in a kind of a European sense, which is a controlled breeding. They probably didn't have breeds in that sense. They undoubtedly did have regional populations and regional differences in dogs. And at least, as I'll show you in a second, there does seem to be a morphotype or a physical form of Native American dogs that we see. Now, we've just done some preliminary DNA and so I can't really, and we're kind of moving into some much more detailed studies of the body and the body shape and the proportional limb size and facial shapes. But I can't really talk about that. I can only talk about some broad categories of body size. So if you would look at a dog, you would notice physical size differences. And there are statistically significant size difference between Euro-American and Native Americans. I don't have enough African-American dogs at this point to kind of put them up there. But Native American dogs actually are pretty small. About 14 kilograms, which is about 30 pounds. So it's a small-sized dog, and there seems to be a fairly small range in body size. The European dogs, however, on the other hand, are huge variability, even early on. Now, I have some body mass numbers that are measuring. I've put modern breeds on the right to give you a scale of what they are. Now, I'm not saying that they had Jack Russells or German Shepherds or anything like that. They're just the size. And what you see is they range from a Jack Russell to a German Shepherd and everything in between. But they, in general, are significantly larger. And you can look at this in just overall body mass or shoulder height. And again, interesting, there's a different set of dogs. The same data, their shoulder height and their body mass don't fit our breeds. Like the Colonial Williamsburg has a gigantic, what probably was called a Mastiff at the time, and it's about the size of a modern Mastiff in terms of shoulder height. It's about half the weight of a modern Mastiff. But similarly, the Native American dogs are kind of a small, medium poodle, whereas the average European dog is about a German Shepherd size. So they are biologically and physically different dogs and genetically different dogs. We've already established that in our research. But I want to look at how they're used. One of the things that unify all three groups is the intentional burial of dogs. And this is not surprising. Practically since dogs first appeared, humans have been burying them. In fact, some of the oldest archaeological sites of dogs are burial sites. This is a broad, cross-cultural relationship that we have with dogs, that upon their death, we bury them. And obviously, today and in the past, the very fact that you're going through the ritual of burial, irrespective of whatever religious or spiritual meaning you have to that, does reflect a close, personal, social, and perhaps religious connections between humans and dogs. So this act is telling us a lot about how people thought of dogs, what their relationship with dogs were, and what they thought the dog's connection was into the afterlife or whatever, however you want to describe that. And dogs are unusual in this. There are cases of horses and some cats and other individual animals, but dogs really are unique in the animal world that people go to all this effort to bury them and have done so for 14,000, 15,000 years. So let's look. So this graph shows the proportion in blue of the number of sites that have dogs with the different African American, Euro Americans, and Native Americans. The sites that have dogs, that the dogs are in burials. And between about a quarter of African American and Euro American sites have burials, and about slightly less than half of Native American dogs. So burial is an incredibly important treatment of dogs at these archaeological sites. How many are buried? Generally, frankly, one. With a very few exceptions and mostly outliers, they have about one dog burial per site. But there are other sites, Buck Farm, Townsend, Hatch, that have multiple. And I'll talk in a minute how that's important. So one of the things is the way African Americans and Europeans buried dogs was very similar. Okay, and frankly, most of the burials that you find archaeologically are in the backyards of residential areas or the work areas, as we'll talk about in a little bit, of businesses. So kind of the private space, often where people live, are where dogs are buried. And they're generally buried like people do today. They dig a small hole, they place the body in them. They generally don't put grave goods, maybe a collar or a tag or something with them. There's only a few sites in which there's more than one dog buried at a Euro-American or African-American site. And Colonial Williamsburg has, their armory has actually the most unusual number for a European site. That has 7 in this big abandoned saw pit that became kind of a communal pet cemetery for some reason. But they're just usually one burial. They're never buried with humans. You never see dogs within humans. And in fact, today, technically, many states have laws where you cannot bury a dog with a human, although I've talked to a number of morticians that actually do it, and it happens all the time. But that's not going on there. There's a few sites, a couple sites, in which dogs were buried in human family plots. So there's a family plot of dead ancestors, and dogs are often placed in that general area to highlight the connection between the dogs and the families. And you could do this in any example. I'm going to pick one example. It's at President Madison's home, Montpelier. And in fact, it's a dog burial in what's called the South Yard, which is an area occupied by enslaved people who were the cooks for the Madison's family. And they had a small work area, sleeping quarters. And in the back of one of the sleeping quarters, in an area that was probably not visible from the main house and certainly not an area that the Madisons would come and visit, in the corner near the house was a small pit dug and a small dog placed inside. Very likely representing the dog of the people, the enslaved people who lived in that house or in the sleeping quarters. And this is again and again archaeologically seen in the backyards. Annapolis, there are dogs buried in the backyards of houses are dogs. And it's a common practice for both Euro-Americans and African-American people. Now, I said one of the surprising things is roughly a quarter of the dog burials are at commercial sites, taverns, warehouses, factories. I even have along a canal kind of that controls the water. I forget what they're called at this moment. But there are dog burials associated with these structures. I want to look at just one random example of a commercial dog, and this is similar across the area. This one is the famous Shield Taverns in Colonial Williamsburg, and you can still go there and have a meal. And in the early 1700s, it was a tavern, just like it is today. People were fed there and housed there. But in the off street, in the back area, probably a work area, a trash disposal area, there was a well back there and some other workshops and storage areas. There was a very small dog in a little informal pit that was placed there. And I talked about the shoulder height, and they had really tiny jackals. This is actually one of the smallest ones. It probably, today, looks like a dachshund. And it was a little animal that actually had a broken leg that healed. Its femur was broken and healed. And very likely, this dog worked on site, worked in the tavern as a turnspit dog. Basically, the roasting of large chunks of meat over a fire needed to be turned continuously. So they're across England, across America, in taverns and other cooking facilities, they set up a little wheel, and it would put basically a little dog in there, and it would walk around and turn the spit and cook the meat. And likely it broke its leg turning, in some sort of accident associated with this wheel. But it healed and was fine and then died, and they buried it in the backyard. Most Native American dog burials fit the general pattern of African Americans and Euro-American dog burials, that they were buried at habitation sites. And that Native Americans buried dogs is not surprising. There is an incredible, deep cultural connection to dogs. And in many Native American cultures, particularly on the East Coast as well as elsewhere, dogs are viewed as non-human people. And in a number of tribes in the East and in the plains and elsewhere, dogs play an important role in mythology and origin stories of tribes. So it's not surprising that they would be treated in a similar way as humans. And at their death would be buried in a grave of their own. Now, most Native American dogs are buried as single individual dogs in a little pit. They often die of natural causes, so you see a lot of very old dogs, very young dogs. They generally are not provided grave goods, maybe a few shells or some artifacts occasionally, but it's like one or two, and not every dog is given a grave offering. At a few sites, there are multiple dog burials. At these village sites, there's multiple dogs, but it's probably because the village was occupied for a long time, so over time, various dogs died and they were buried. For most dog burial sites, there's not an association with humans. Humans were not buried with a dog or vice versa. And it was very rare. And the exceptions really are often a human that's buried with a dog bone, either a skull or a jaw or maybe a tool. Most frequently, dog teeth seem to be drilled, put on a necklace, and was worn as an ornamentation. And the person, as they died, were buried with that. So they really weren't buried with the dog. They just happened to be buried with the dog remains. And that's what most Native American dog burials are associated with. Very similar to that. Dog dies, you bury it not in your house, but kind of adjacent in your residence or near your residence. Now, there is a couple exceptions. There's about 5 of them. The Hand site, the Hatch site, the Buck Farm in Virginia, the Townsend site in Delaware, and a site in Maryland are different. These, I said the exception, there's these exceptions with lots of dogs. It's these roughly 5 sites. All of them date before 1400. So all of them occur before contact with Europeans. And they all have a high number of dog burials, in excess of 10. And they're not habitation sites. These are not villages people lived in, or at least during the time of the burials. And they are ceremonial sites that seem to be used for rituals that involve communal feasting and mortuary rituals that involve both humans and dogs. And at these sites, you often have individual dogs, multiple dogs, or humans and dogs. In many cases, more humans than dogs. In other cases, more dogs than humans in the same pit, in the same burial pit. And many of the dogs are not buried in just a simple grave with just little or no offerings. They're in giant, large pits that are full of butchered bones, especially deer and fish, broken pots, exotic artifacts, shell, and beads. And they're not living at these sites. There's not houses at these sites, but there are occasionally very unusually large ceremonial houses or structures, really, in there, in some cases where dogs are buried within these kind of large ceremonial structures. And we haven't done detailed investigation of a lot of these dogs, only a couple sites, the Hatch site being one of them. And unlikely to do it because there's often a co-association with human burials in the same features. But at least a number of these dogs, unlike you see in many other places, did not die naturally. There are repeated evidence of them being stabbed, blows to the head, or even strangled at the time that they're placed in the pit. And this dog kind of sacrifice is very likely a ritual of itself that's part of these larger feasts and mortuary ceremonies that involve the internment and burial of humans as well. So they're a critical part of a major multi-community ritual center is dog burials. I want to talk about something that probably is one of the more taboo things that we can talk about, and that is the use of dog flesh as food. Now, I don't need a show of hands to ask you if you're sickened by the prospect of the idea of eating a dog. And that is true for our culture, for many cultures. That it is an abhorrent idea to eat a dog. Now, in 2018, Congress went to the extent to actually make it illegal, a federal crime, to butcher a dog for consumption. Not to eat the dog, there's other reasons why they couldn't do that, but they could do it, you could not butcher a dog. So it is this unacceptable idea that we eat dogs. And these quotes I just pulled from reports and articles, and the archaeologists, informed by their own culture, essentially reject the idea that people ate dogs, of any culture. Maybe if there's like an extreme famine or something, if you had no other choice, you could do it. But otherwise, these were pets, these were companions, you did not eat these. I think thou dost protest too much. In many cultures, in our own, and particularly in American culture, there are hundreds of reports of sailors, explorers, that ate dogs on a regular basis. Beyond that, in these two New York Times articles from the late 1800s, just said people did it. It was not an acceptable thing to do, but it was a thing people did. And in different cultures, in different traditions, in our own culture, it was not as taboo as it is today. To say that early Americans or enslaved people or Native Americans didn't eat dogs is an overly simplified view. So I wanted to look at that. So where are the non-mortuary dogs are? Where are the individual dogs found? Well, across cultures, in about a third of the cases, they're found in trash pits. This is rubbish pits where food debris, butchered animals were dumped. Now, dogs make up a very small quantity of the animal remains from this. They're mostly things like sheep and pigs and cattle in historic times, or deer and fish and others. But those features that have all these butchered deer and these cattle that no one's questioning are being eaten are dogs. And it is true across cultures that in the food trash of all these groups, in about a third of the sites I looked at, there is a dog. It's not buried. It's not what I'm talking about in terms of the ritual ones. They're not burials. They're just individual dog bones. Third of the trash has dog in them. So let's look more precisely. Let's look at unequivocal archaeological evidence, cut marks, butchery marks, impacts for extracting marrow. If you look at that, only about a 4%, a very small percentage of Native American dogs seem to have evidence of butchery marks. 12 to 15% of European and African American sites that have dogs in rubbish have documented butchery marks. Now, most of the dogs are not being looked at for butchery marks, so it's a small subsample that I have, but I still have a big percent. Now, here's the interesting, if you look at the age of sites that have dog marks, very large percentage of them occur within the first 150 years of colonial settlement. And a few European and Native and African American sites go into the late 1700s, not quite the 1800s. Almost no sites, pre-contact Native American sites have dogs. There's one represented here. And really, it's, as I'll show in a second, it's just before 1600. So this 1750, there's a huge amount of butchered dogs. What does that look like? So my colleagues and I did an intensive study of the English colony of Jamestown. And all of the dogs, or almost all of the dogs, were intensively butchered. And this is, while this site is very well studied and has a lot of dogs, frankly, what it is, you see them, if you look at where the cut marks are below, they're taking off along the face for skinning, or along the lower limbs for skinning. They are removing the tongue. They are putting it in areas where you would disarticulate two bones together. Or they're in areas where you'd fillet meat. The archaeological reports are full of things, but that is not a dog, it is a sheep or a pig. It's the same technique. They're using the same systems. The sheep and pigs, there's no question, are being eaten. They're skinning, they're disarticulating, they're defleshing, they're extracting the brain, they're extracting the bone marrow. They're eating these dogs. And this is what butchery looks like during this period. And it is true at the English site of Jamestown. It is true at African American sites and a small number of Native American sites. Now, this period in the the late 1500s to early 1700s is actually a time that many researchers have previously identified as a period of large degree of drought on the East Coast. And in fact, there's arguments made that the failures at Roanoke and the starving times at Jamestown are a function of this drought period where other food was just difficult to obtain. So this graph is a reconstruction, and the lower one is from 1560 to 1720. And when the line goes below and it's black is a drought period. When it goes above, it's a better rain period. It's not a drought period. If you put the dates of the African American, the Native American, and a lot of the Euro-American sites that have dog butchery, unequivocal evidence, they seem to surprisingly fall within these drought times. Now, that said, it doesn't explain everything. There's a bunch of other sites that have it, mostly European sites, that actually fall outside this period and are not actually associated with drought periods. So the big story, particularly with indigenous people and many of the early colonial sites, the dog butchery does seem to be a solution in a time of drought, which is perhaps associated with food scarcity and things like that. But not all of them. It's not a perfect solution, and there's a lot more that are outside this time period, and we need to kind of understand why that's happening. All right, I've kind of gone a bit long. So what have we learned? Dogs are everywhere. They're ubiquitous. All cultures have them. And in many ways, they serve the same roles and functions. They're companions, they're workers. But they're also symbols of class, symbols of ethnicity. They are symbols of differences between people and what kind of dog you have and who you are. They are often, particularly in colonial powers, they are what other researchers have called a bioweapon. They are a tool of war to discriminate, harass, and marginalize non-white people in this area. But across cultures, through time, people had deep connections with them. And those connections were personal, they were social, they spanned death, and particularly in Native Americans, they were a critical part of important rituals that brought communities together and signified social connectedness, social connections among different groups that practice these same rituals. Dogs were eaten. They were never a staple, but it existed. And as deeply and connected we had with dogs through this time period, in times of stress, social taboos are not there. I think that people recognized that they could assist people even in their most dire time of need. And that is true about dogs throughout history, prehistory. Dogs are always by our side, and we're using them and interacting with them. And we have to understand that our dogs today are part of a long history and play, in many ways, the same exact role that they have for thousands of years, and across time and across space and across cultures. Thank you very much. I just want to thank all the people in the and the Native American tribes who've been greatly supporting of this, and all my collaborators. And I want to certainly thank all of Archaeology Southwest for providing me this opportunity. Thank you very much.
We're now going to open up the floor for questions. I see a question.
Hi, thank you for that. I'm interested in when you talked about the indigenous dogs that came probably with the people when they first came here from Siberia or wherever. And you had it, you didn't mention it, but I saw it in the writing, is they didn't bark or howl. And that just grabbed me, like, what?
Oh, sorry, I skipped over that. The early English colonists were actually super interested in dogs, of Native American dogs. And in fact, they were interested in their own dogs. So some of the first, particularly at Jamestown and elsewhere, they were sent out and they were asked, what are the Native American dogs like? And their report was they described them as wolf, and then variously as wolf, like wolves. They were variously described as the size of a British fox. But in and around Jamestown, it was striking that they were described as they didn't bark or howl. I don't know, as with European accounts, they were probably biased. And in fact, the dog descriptions themselves were constantly that, the Native Americans didn't even own the dogs. They just kind of ran around. They didn't breed them. So they had lots of other things. And, given that the elite of Europeans viewed themselves as well-bred, and their own breeding gave them status, and their dog breeding was important to give status, it's not surprising they didn't think these mongrels or curs or however they pejoratively described native dogs were there. But they apparently didn't bark, according to
Okay,
John
I
Smith.
saw a question over here. Raise your hand if you had a question. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, you sort of touched on it in the answer to the last question. I was curious how much archival or information from journals throughout the historic period talk about dogs.
A shocking amount. One of the things that European colonialism, one of the biggest kind of proponents in the 1500s, who was really kind of encouraging England to get into this, and we had to fight Spain and take over control, actually wrote very popular, essentially, article or story that was distributed. And one of the things that was part of that is a list of things you need to be successful in a colony. And dogs were one of them. And in particularly mastiffs for defense, bloodhounds for hunting, and greyhounds for chasing Native Americans. He literally said this. And so dogs were brought, all the early explorers brought them. So there was constant accounts of the dogs being used. The Spanish, in fact, developed this system of kind of the war dog, of using large mastiffs to attack Native Americans and chase Native Americans. And they realized that they were never going to kind of turn Native Americans to their side, so they kind of used dogs and other weapons of war on them. And in fact, they started a breeding program in the late 1400s in Cuba to specifically breed big Mastiff-like dogs for attack. And that breeding program lasted into the 1700s. And American slave owners, in fact, would buy these Spanish dogs from Cuba because they were so well trained and so vicious and ideal for kind of harassing and chasing slaves and enslaved people. So they were constantly being reported on and talked about.
Okay, we have time for one more question in the front row. I'm coming from the other side.
I was just wondering, were wolves a concern during those times? And did the dogs get into toss-ups with wolves? And were coyotes a thing back in that period? What kind of threats did the dogs have from wild animals?
So there were wolves, and in fact, there were attempts to kind of eradicate the wolves because they were viewed as harmed. And in fact, a lot of the African Americans would talk about wanting their own dogs to protect them from these kind of wild animals like wolves and all that. So they were there in part to protect them from wolves. Coyotes don't get there until much, much later in time. They were really a plains, but they do eventually get, and they're all over this area today. So there are a variety of other wolves and other bears and things like that dogs were intentionally used as to kind of chase off or to help protect from.
Well, thank you so much. Let's give another round of applause to Professor Hill.